Janice, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, it'd be a pleasure. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Thanks
how's it going?
It's good.
Yeah.
Really good. My cat did not wake me up last night, which is that's always a bonus. She's still a little bit of a kitten. So.
Oh, how old is she?
She's about a year old.
Nice.
And she really, really, really likes to play at 3 a.m. and often jumps on my face.
Yeah, I've got cats too, and they definitely sleep with us. And I've got that. One of my cats actually is, I think he's got like a deviated septum or something, because he sounds like Darth Vader. So I sit on my pillow and just like, I'm trying to get some sleep. And it's always like the 1 hour before I need to wake up.
Yeah.
So I'm just like, I just want 1 more hour of sleep. Welcome to the 20th episode of Femgineer TV, brought to you by Pivotal Tracker. I'm your host, Poornima Vijayashanker, the founder of Femgineer. In this show, I host innovators in tech, and together we debunk myths and misconceptions related to building products and companies in tech. Working on teams is great because we get to share our skills and learn from one another. However, there are moments that can be really challenging, such as trying to get buy-in from our teammates or try to get through a lot of processes that can be bureaucratic. And it can be demotivating when it comes to innovation. So how do you get groups of people to work together, deliver on innovations, and expose any weaknesses that are in their strategy? Well, these are just a few questions that we're going to answer in today's episode. And to help us out, I've invited Janice Fraser, who is the director on the people team at Pivotal. Janice has a rich career spanning 20 years, where she's had notable accomplishments, like being the CEO and founder of Luxr, as well as Adaptive Path, and more. Thanks so much for joining us, Janice.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So I'm excited to talk about all the work that you do, but before we dive into that, I want to go back to the beginning and walk me through early career and some of the key learnings that you had in those early years.
Sure. Happy to do that. So my career started a very long time ago. And before kind of the internet thing happened, I was a magazine editor, but really kind of the work, and I learned a lot then.
Yeah.
But the work that we're going to talk about today really started in 1996, about 6 months after Netscape's IPO. I joined that team. And it was a wild time. We were trying to figure out that there was this new thing, the public web, and Netscape, for those who were not born yet, Netscape was the company that created that. They were the first publicly distributed web browser, and it was really a very heady time. I was there for 18 months, and when I started, we had 2 buildings in Mountain View, California, and when I left 18 months later, we had 36 buildings.
Oh, wow.
Right, the amount of growth, like, even puts Facebook's like ascent, into context. So we were trying at that time to figure out, like, what do you do with this thing? Like, so we have this internet thing, and Netscape had literally 100% of all internet traffic, public internet traffic went through the Netscape website. So that was kind of the kickoff of my really deep tech kind of like, what do we do with tech career? And after that, really, I didn't have another regular job until I started at Pivotal a few years ago, because I did what is now very popular, but at the time was very rare. I went independent. I'm like, I'm just like, I'm going to do this stuff, but I'm going to do it just, as a lone wolf. And, it felt like jumping off a cliff to not have a company supporting you, but it was a blast. And at a certain point, just a few years later, one of my clients said, I'm going to start a company. I was consulting for Silicon Graphics. My client said, I'm going to start a company. Would you be my co-founder? And so, my official career as an entrepreneur started then. That company, it was the heyday of the dot-com boom. That company literally was acqui-hired 4 months after it was founded.
Oh, wow.
By a division, a subsidiary of Whole Foods. And we were called Whole People. And so we did that. And then the dot bust happened. And that, so it was like, I've had this series of just incredible experiences. I've started more than 6 companies. One of them you mentioned was Adaptive Path. I would say that company had a tremendous impact. It was never a large company. We never took funding, but we did develop a product and sell it to Google for cash in 10 months with a 12x. We got 12x back from our investment. It was incredible. So I was a founder and CEO of that company. It was really amazing. I was there for 6 years. I left there to start the next thing, which was when I was an entrepreneur in residence for K4 Capital. So, really lovely times. Adaptive Path was notable because we were trying to figure out, okay, so if Netscape was what do we do with the internet? Adaptive Path was how do we do it and make it not suck, right?
So, and you had a lot of notable designers and engineers working. I know we had Indy Young on the show earlier.
I love Indy. She's a genius, absolute genius. So we were very privileged at both of those companies to be intellectually in community with a bunch of people who were trying to figure out what do we do with this thing that is unfigured out, right? And so it was a community. The company itself was a community, and then we were participating in a community of thought. So we really were arguably the first user experience firm ever. Mm-hmm. And we were part of this emerging user experience field. And the next time I had that kind of experience was Luxr, which, it was a venture-funded startup. I found out later from some research at Babson College that only 186 female CEOs were funded during that period of time. Mm-hmm. There was a 3-year period of time. Out of 6,500 venture fundings, I was one of those 186. So I take that as a real kind of badge of honor. But we were, again, trying to figure out, we were at that edge of something new. Mm-hmm. And we were trying to figure out how people could practice entrepreneurship more consciously and more successfully. And, we were sort of supported and inspired by a couple of investors who wanted their product portfolio to suck less, right? So how can we get teams of entrepreneurs? This is where I started thinking about this team thing in a much more explicit way. Mm-hmm. Always getting people to do things together was an issue or a question that I was interested in. But that's where I really tried to hone in on what is it that gets people to collaborate effectively. Because when you're a startup, when you're starting from zero and you have to show results very quickly, that core team must be extraordinarily functional.
Oh, yes.
And so at Luxr, we really tried to perfect that practice. And so we ran what's, it would now be considered an accelerator program. Mm-hmm. This was right at the advent of the real explosion in entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. And we had about 50 companies go through a 12-week program where they would come to our studio 1 day a week for 10 weeks, and would work on their products all day. And sometimes when we were screening companies to come into the program, they'd say, well, I can't take a day off of work. And I said, okay, so you think that it's a day off to spend a day with your core team working on your product.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that concept. And they went, oh, right?
Right.
So, and how they responded to that challenge was part of what made us want to work with a company or not. It was like, are they willing to stop pitching their VCs, et cetera, and just make decisions about product for a day? Mm-hmm. At Luxr, we explored a couple of really core ideas, which I think I'd like to talk about a little bit today. One is balanced team, because that really talks about how teams function, and it's sort of about how do we govern teams that are self-governing. And the other is lean startup, which is not just for startups anymore, I would say. And both of those things became real cornerstones of what we practiced at Luxr, and now what we've brought into Pivotal. Our whole Luxr team joined Pivotal. It was not an acquisition. I just want to be clear about that. Sure. It was sort of an acquisition, but we brought the whole team in because this gives us a platform to do this work on a much larger scale. So that's kind of the arc of the career that's brought us to this conversation today.
Yeah. And mind you, you didn't have an entrepreneurial background, like you didn't have parents or growing up, you weren't thinking like, I'm going to wake up in the morning and be an entrepreneur.
Well, I never thought of it as a career option for a lot of reasons. I mean, I came up in the early 80s, right? My high school was in the 80s. Like nobody talked about this stuff. I'm from Ohio. We didn't know. Yeah. I didn't know a single person in technology, let alone entrepreneurship. But before there was entrepreneurship in today's form, there were people who started businesses. And my father was an independent business person for most of his career. He was an engineer. He designed radioactive waste disposal systems. Okay.
It's pretty compelling. Yeah.
It turns out.
Yeah, it's important work.
Important work. But he did that as an independent business person. My stepmother started a support center in rural Ohio for families and people who are affected by addiction. So again, entrepreneurial, but not entrepreneurship in its current form.
Sure.
So that kind of thinking has always been around. Same is true of my husband's family. His father had his own business. His mother was an international business person in a manufacturing capacity. So while I had absolutely no idea that entrepreneurship was an option, that it would be right for me, it certainly was in my DNA. And so that seeking that happens when you're working at the edge of newness, which I think is really the theme of my career.
Yeah.
That comes from that desire to create something out of nothing, to make things better by making things differently. So I think it fits intellectually, even though there was no formal training.
Yeah, actually, that's what I was going to ask next. So it seems like you didn't have formal training, but you very quickly adapted into these roles, like being the CEO and founder. How did that transition happen?
Sure. Well, so my first CEO role was at Adaptive Path. And when we started Adaptive Path, there were 7 founders.
Yeah.
So lesson learned, don't start a company with 7 people, mostly because the teamwork involved, the amount of communication overhead is really extraordinary. But
how so?
There's a principle that's a lot easier to illustrate when I have a bunch of people in the room, because I can line them up and make them shake hands. So let's say 3 people are meeting each other for the first time. 3 people, you say, shake hands, let's count the handshakes. You get 3 handshakes. You add a 4th person to that dynamic and you say, let's meet each other for the first time. And what you're going to get is 6 handshakes. You add 1 person, you double the number of handshakes. And there's actually a mathematical formula behind this, n times n minus 1 over 2. And the reason that matters is this. Agreement happens when, among other things, people agree to stop talking. People stop talking when they feel understood. And all of this actually comes out of sales research.
Okay.
Right? Tons of research has been done on behavioral psychology for sales, right? So people stop talking when they feel understood, and understanding happens between individual pairs of brains. So when you have that dynamic of adding 1 more person has this n times n minus 1 over 2 formula, you get an extraordinary number of those soft agreements that have to happen between individuals before they want to stop talking, before they feel understood, and before you can make decision. So for instance, I love Adaptive Path, extraordinarily special place, but it took us 6 months of talking for 10 minutes every Tuesday at our team meeting, 6 months to decide whether or not to buy a $300 printer. And that was excruciating to me. I just never want to have that happen ever again. I never want others to have to experience that. So I would say that as a founding team, when I was working with a very large number of teams, so observing 50 teams allows you to kind of see patterns. And what I found is that the teams that had 3 or 2 founders were much more efficient than the teams that had 5, 4, right? Larger numbers. The teams that brought groups that could be divided into subgroups of 3 were able to make progress, make interesting things happen with very rapid progress. Teams of 2 tended to fall a little bit flat.
Okay.
And teams of 4, 5, 6 just had extraordinarily more debate. And when they made decisions, those decisions were much softer. It was a lot easier to derail the decision. So you used the word buy-in earlier. I hate that phrase.
Yeah.
I hate meetings. I hate the word buy-in.
Right.
I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I just think is not efficient.
Right.
And the thing about buy-in is that it's often used as a very non-specific descriptor for something that we don't know how to define. So part of what I look for is something more refined, something more specific. And I call it the you-bad model. The you-bad, because you bad, right? You can remember that. Understanding, belief, advocacy, decision. So if you have, for instance, decision-making without understanding, that's a very soft position. And it means that maybe sometime later, that person's going to get surprised.
You shoot from the hip.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and sometimes people think they understand, but their understanding is only a surface understanding, not a deep understanding. We see that sometimes here at Pivotal. Clients will be like, you guys do extreme programming, you do pairing. This is fantastic. I want to come in. I'm like, what do you mean you have to sit next to a developer all day?
Yeah.
Right. And so when there are surprises like that, now you can say, I can watch for depth of understanding, and then I can watch for belief. And then I can see whether that decision then has durability. So what we're looking for in all of this is really durable decision making, durable advocacy that's actually going to help us to move forward in an aligned way. And so what you can do as a founder or as a team member is diagnose your buy-in by saying, do we have belief and that is supported by understanding in our advocacy, in our decisions? That's really what we're talking about. So buy-in is a broad term that is sometimes really not very specifically understood. And sometimes we feel powerless over it, right? Because like, I think that you agree with me, but I don't really know. And, and now with this kind of model, with this sort of more granular model, we can begin to diagnose, like, how is everybody in the room feeling about what's going on right now?
Yeah. So having that 7-person team did not help with this model, but scaling back to a smaller team certainly helped.
Well, I learned so much from that 7-person team. I mean, they're all just absolutely brilliant people. And it was such a magnificently effective company in so many ways. But those team dynamics were sometimes very rocky and difficult to manage. And decision-making was somewhat slow in those early years. So the part of what we were talking about before I took us off track was how I became CEO.
Right.
And I think that that's a really interesting story for some people who are earlier in their careers and want to get those opportunities. So as I said, for the first 2 years, we were an egalitarian partnership. We voted on everything, which was great for where we were, because we were really we were a small business. We just wanted the 7 of us to do the work.
Yeah. We
didn't hire a team. We had 1 employee at first, number 1. He was number 1. He became the COO of the company. And what that meant is that we could not grow. And we were doing so well financially. We had more work than we could, handle. We were, we closed most of the business that we pursued. And so we were leaving money on the table, and we knew that we could have a significant impact if we allowed the company to grow. And so that meant that we needed to organize, because you can't have this complete consensus model if you want to have staff, if you want to have more growth opportunity. So we decided to grow the company. We decided to do that without taking any financing. We, at the time, were organized around being a user experience firm, because user experience was still very new. So we did events and workshops and consulting, and we wrote papers and a number of other things. And so what I stepped up to do, I was already sort of a leader of that part of the company. So what I stepped up to do was organize something we called Project Adaptive Future. Like, what do we want to be? And so we did a 5 or 6 month exploration of what do we want to be? How would we be organized? What are our core values? What do we stand for now that we're a few years into this journey? And that Project Adaptive Future really laid out the roadmap and the strategy for what we did in the next several years. And after I led that project, I said, look, this is the work of a CEO, and I want that job.
Yeah.
And so, one of the things that we hear about women is that we don't ask for what we want or deserve.
Right.
And this is one of those moments that I'm so proud that I asked for it and I got it. And in the years that I was the CEO, we did very well. And I'm super proud that I had that insight to do it. And looking back, I don't know how I had the guts to ask for the job.
Well, if you were already doing the work, why not?
Well, but yes.
Makes sense.
In retrospect, that sounds right.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was like, for me, it was a pretty ballsy move.
Yeah. And then after that, what happened after you were at Adaptive Path? Because Adaptive Path eventually got sold to Capital One.
Right. And I was long gone by then.
Yeah. Okay.
It had moved on. I left my last day was, I think, December 31st, 2006. Which decade was that?
Yeah.
2006.
1 decade ago. Yeah.
And I went to Capor Capital.
Okay.
And was on entrepreneur residence there, explored a few ideas, and then moved on to, within Capor Capital, I started another startup. That one was super interesting. It's how I met Pivotal. I was their client first.
Okay. Yeah.
But it was 2007, 8, 9. And I it was very high-minded. We were mapping the social network of the past. It was an answer to genealogy. It was like super high-minded, not a clear revenue model. And by, I would say, January 2009, those companies had no future because we all remember no venture financings in January 2009. And the things that were going to have a future as a startup had to really be very clear. They had to have a very clear path to profitability. Mm-hmm. So that's what happened to that one. Yeah. But that led to Luxr, and Luxr was really incredible. Again, one of those super small companies that was very influential.
Talk to us about what Luxr did, and then how that transitioned into the work that you're doing now. Sure.
So Luxr, as I said before, Luxr was about helping entrepreneurs be more predictably successful. And because we were entirely focused on understanding the patterns that led to effective, efficient decision making, that led to growth, that led to positive, what we now would call net promoter scores, like really positive metrics-based decision making. We were very focused on fact-based decision making. And so some of the things that we take for granted now, things like the Google design sprint, that 1 week innovation sprint that they do, that's the kind of stuff that we were doing at the time. So what we were able to do was develop a methodology rooted in good user experience, rooted in business model canvas thinking, rooted in lean startup. And it was through that work that we really saw the value of balanced team. And so maybe this is now a good time to talk about what balanced team actually is, right? So there's this idea that when we're working on a product team, but I've also now learned that it works for a lot of other kinds of teams. When you're creating a thing, whether that's a policy, as I've done with government, when you're creating a policy or a product or a process, when we're inventing that new thing, in many cases, the old way would be to have somebody who had some sort of business analyst kind of title or business analyst sort of responsibility, or maybe it was the CEO of a startup who thought they knew everything, would write down what it's supposed to be and then hand that off to somebody who was supposed to make the thing. Yes. So we had one person who was imbued with the power to think it up, and then everybody else had to execute on that. The problem with that is that the things that we're doing are so complex that person or team that's supposed to think it up, they actually don't have complete information. So a group of people started to really think about patterns that they had seen that were effective. And that got kind of labeled a balanced team. That set of patterns includes things like shared ownership. So rather than separating thinking it up and executing on it, what we want is to have I'm going to describe this as a software thing, but it really extends way beyond software. But we're Femgineer TV, so I think I'm safe. Yeah. So in a software team, I would say that user experience is one of the core functions. And for most software, the user experience person is what I would call the empathizer in chief. Everybody has an equal responsibility to understand customers, to understand users, to understand that complexity. But somebody should make it their life's work to know how to do that right. And how to translate that into experiences. So that person, that user experience person, is it's a vertical function, it's a craft, and somebody should own that as an expert, right? So we should always know that we can turn to that user experience person to have an authoritative voice about what the most important customer problems are to solve and whether or not this product is solving them. So that's one role. The next role is the engineering role. So you think about engineers, I say raise high the roof beams carpenters, right? They're the people who can invent the best possible solutions given available technical capabilities. There's no way anybody else on the team is going to be as expert at that as the engineer. And then you have the product manager. And we used to have requirements and project managers. That whole infrastructure should be thrown out the window. If you're still doing that, I'm sorry. It's wrong. Throw it out the window. I'm so sorry. It's just not efficient, and it doesn't turn out software that is reliably effective. And it's that effectiveness piece that makes it not fun, not good. So the product manager, not project manager. Product manager is a horizontal function. So if engineering and design, UX design are both craft, this is really about understanding the breadth of conflicting priorities and navigating that difficult space of, the business needs this, the user needs that, like all of these, different competing interests. And somewhere in there, we have to navigate that. And I would say that that person's real special skill is about understanding the nuanced balance and making decisions in the face of inadequate information. Mm-hmm. So a product manager's genius is to be able to make calls in the face of inadequate information. So that set of people, you can see how there's no one person on that team that should run the show.
Right.
So balanced team says that we have trust in each other to be experts in our disciplines, that we respect each other's ability to make the decision. So rather than saying there's one person who is the authority and they're going to make the call, you say, okay, you know what? Product manager says, you know what? I think that this is really a user experience issue, so I'm going to trust you to make the call. And by the way, if you make a call and we discover that it's not right, I've got your back. Mm-hmm. So that respect comes with the safety that we know we're going to make bad calls. Yeah. We know we're going to make mistakes. And it's okay because we have enough respect that we're all in it together, that we are going to support one another in that. So what that means is that we stop hoarding. So what's interesting about this is that this all came out of really a bunch of people who were out of a user experience background who wanted to partner with developers. But it mirrors almost completely extreme programming, which is the kind of programming that we do here at Pivotal. And extreme programming in the book, there's a book. It outlines, courage, trust, respect, feedback, and simplicity as core values. And that's really what Balanced Team is about. That trust and respect and feedback is about being able to move quickly because we have all the right people in the room to do the work that needs to get done every single day. And we respect one another to allow there to be, it's not delegated decision-making because there's no delegator. Yeah. Allows there to be appropriate placement of decision-making and respect of those decisions. And everything is a decision. How we write our code, every line of code is a decision. Every wireframe we make on the design side, that's a decision. That's 100 decisions, right? So decision-making and ideation, I believe, are the two skills of every team. We have a business problem. Let's think some stuff up. Let's evaluate those ideas, and then let's make a call to move forward. And afterwards, we're going to watch what happens. We're going to measure the results. We're going to observe the outcomes, and then we'll learn from that. And that's really the core of Lean Startup. So it's like Lean Startup, design thinking, balanced team, XP, it all really is a package that equates to what I think of as modern software making. But I will say it also applies to so many other situations.
So one question I get a lot from engineering leads as well as startup founders is, as they're growing their team, they might have a lot of senior folks. And I've even experienced teams where they have 7 senior developers and they're all kind of vying for who's going to become a director, VP, etc. And it's often a good time to bring somebody on that may be less experienced. But how do those folks who are learning or less experienced fit into this model of a balanced team?
Sure. So a balanced team does not mean there are only 3 people on the team, but it does mean that there are 3 leaders on any team. And I believe in the 2 pizza rule, right? So you have kind of these people who are leading their teams, but from this balanced point of view. And the question of when and how to bring in younger talent, I think is, I would say relatively early in a company's development, but you have to make an explicit decision that you're going to nourish those people, that you're going to help develop them. We practice pair programming, and I think one of the special things about pair programming is that it's sort of automatic apprenticeship.
Yes.
So it's pretty straightforward that you can pair your junior people with more senior people, and then you can rotate. One of the things about pairing is that you rotate pairs fairly frequently, sometimes in some practices daily. And that pair rotation allows those younger people to figure out who they are as developers, to explore their own creative ways of solving problems. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's that pairing of experience and novice that set of combinations is good for everybody in the system. Because, I mean, there's just so many reasons that it's good for everything. So one is that you learn the most by teaching.
Oh, definitely. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So having to explain something to somebody forces you to think things through. Now, another thing that we do that XP does, that Pivotal does, is test-driven development.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I'm a big proponent of that.
And so TDD, right? You do test-driven development. You're writing the test first. You're thinking through the problem. Right? And I think it was Einstein who said, if I had 10 minutes to solve a problem, I'd spend 9 minutes understanding the problem and 1 minute solving it. Mm-hmm. That's kind of how I think of TDD. Again, what better way to teach a younger developer to develop, to evolve that younger developer into somebody more senior.
And why is it hard to onboard less experienced people onto the design or product management teams?
Sure. There are a couple reasons. There are two specifically. One is that it's more subjective work. With software development, especially with test-driven development, the test, your code either passes or fails the test, and you can work at it until it passes. With user experience design, for instance, whether it's the structure and function or the aesthetics or any number of sub-disciplines within that, the decision making about what good is not binary. It's not that it passes or it fails. And so what you really need to do is develop subjective judgment. So it's just harder, right?
It takes time.
Now, if you're in an environment where you can pair design, that's something that's being tried. We do it here at Pivotal. There are a number of folks who out in the world who are interested in doing that and who practice it. For many organizations, for many designers, it's considered a luxury.
Okay.
So the efficiency that we find in pair programming hasn't been substantiated yet in the pair design program. I happen to think that pair designing is extraordinarily powerful as a tool, and that a designer should never be flying solo on a project.
Yeah.
I just don't think that that's appropriate or right. It means that you don't have an intellectual peer group to explore with. So that's design. On the product management side, again, it's considered a luxury to have a second product manager on a particular project or sub-project.
Yeah, usually it's like 1 to 8 or something like that.
Yeah. So at Pivotal, we have a different kind of ratio. So from a hiring numbers standpoint, we've gone from 1 designer per 50 labs, software developers. That was, when I started a few years ago, like 3 years ago, it was probably 1 to 50. Now it's like 1 to 5.
Okay. So yeah, it seems more reasonable.
Yeah. And it's, I would say that that's very progressive to have that many designers. And I would say the same ratio is probably true of the product management team. So with product managers, it can be super beneficial to pair. So our product managers at Pivotal Labs pair with the client's product managers. And that combination allows for really solid decision making because you can talk through the decisions as you go. Anyway, so because pairing is not as much a thing, it can be very difficult to bring your younger PMs up because I said product management involves a lot of decision making in the face of inadequate evidence.
Right.
And it's about explicitly balancing conflicting points of view or conflicting needs and requirements. And so that, again, is about judgment. And judgment can only really be informed by experience and by depth of knowledge about the situations. So I think that it's much more of a mentorship, apprenticeship model than for those two disciplines than for engineering. And so we just have to invest a lot more deliberately and explicitly in growing those people rather than sort of it just comes with doing TDD and pairing.
We've concentrated our conversation up to this point on software and tech companies, but you've actually worked with a lot of different types of organizations. You've worked with government and enterprise companies as well. So let's dive into that a little bit. Talk to me about who you've worked with and what you've discovered in the process in terms of how they've managed their teams.
Sure. Well, and it really has been an honor and a privilege to do the wide variety of applications of these ideas. So I have worked with some of the largest foundations, the Packard Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, like huge foundations. I've introduced these ideas to people who work in national security and everything in between. We had in one of our programs, we explicitly were working with people who are not in tech and who were deliberately small business. So we had somebody who manufactured broom storage solutions.
Nice.
Right? We had another person who was working on an alternative to the nebulizer, which people with asthma will know a lot about. So we've applied these ideas in just a vast array of contexts. I would say that probably the most extreme environment that we've worked with is a program that we supported through Luxr and that the work has continued through at Pivotal with the White House. So the Obama administration has a professional development program for kind of senior leaders. And that program has been going, we've just wrapped it, but it went for about 3 years. And through that, we've had sort of director and deputy director level people from pretty much every agency in the government. And because it's this longitudinal program, it's a 6-month-long program, they come in, we do a workshop with them. And our workshop is month 2 when they're about to start their projects, and then they do a project. So what we're introducing there is what we package as lean startup. But really, it's a lot about these team dynamics. What are the behaviors when people get together? We divide them into the groups of 3, like all of that sort of thing. Now, with Lean Startup, part of what we're doing is we're asking people to analyze their assumptions, identify which ones represent a leap of faith, where we may or may not have enough evidence, identify of those, which ones are represent kind of fatal risk to the project.
Yeah.
We will not have the impact we need to have if we are wrong about this. And the purpose of that is to expose the weaknesses in our strategy before they have a negative impact on our mission. So when you put that into the context of leaders, whether it's, the Department of Homeland Security or, the IRS, right? We've worked with all of these organizations. They all, because these are just human realities. We all make assumptions. We all come up with plans and ideas. Those plans and ideas are laden with assumptions that we have no proof for, and some of those assumptions represent potential flaws in our strategy. And so what we need to do is get explicit about that and then design very small scale, very rapid ways to learn whether or not those are true. That's it. It's super rational. It's just how do we debug human thinking and decision making? That's all it is. So I'd like to tell you a story.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I can't tell you the real story because it is highly confidential. It affects the safety of people in the United States from what we might consider to be a security point of view. So let's say that there is an organization within the administration that has to screen a very large number of things. Let's call them minivans.
Yeah.
Right. So we're going to talk about the minivan project. All right. So I had this participant in one of our workshops not so long ago. And she's like, I love this way of thinking, this lean startup stuff, this assumptions and developing experiments. This is great. But I have no idea how I'm going to apply it to my context. Like I work in a policymaking organization that deals with minivans and we need to keep Americans safe. That's just not how we work. Okay, sure. That's fine. Invitation not to buy. You may or may not be able to use this in your work, but I'd like you to try it. At the end of the day, she was like, this is fantastic. I still don't know how I'm going to use it.
Let's stop right there. So you said invitation not to buy. What's that?
Okay. Again, I learned the most ever from my sales trainer. Yeah. And she said, you can release pressure if you just let people invite them not to buy your idea.
Yeah.
You just say like, it's okay. I don't care if you ever use these again.
Yes.
But if you give it just one try,
right,
maybe you'll find something that's valuable. So I say, it's okay. And it truly is. If you don't see that this is valuable to you, don't do it.
Right.
It's fine. So I had this tough customer and she said, end of the day, I love this. I'm glad I tried it, but I don't see how it's going to apply. I get an email from her a few months later. Well, I had this thing. We were supposed to, the president wants us to screen all these minivans, let's say hundreds of thousands of minivans, so that we can, approve some smaller number of that through some screening process. Okay. So that's the situation. She said, we figured out that we were going to be 20,000 minivans short by the end of the year. And we could not figure out how we were going to get past that. And, we needed to screen all of these so that we could get this number, and we're going to be 20,000 short. And it's really sad. It's really sad because we really need those minivans. Okay, so after we tried everything and decided that we weren't going to be able to make our goal, we decided to just give this lean startup thing a try. So she got a few people together, a very small number of people together, and they analyzed their assumptions, which were basically their screening criteria. And they identified a small number of screening criteria that were very cumbersome to use, that were slowing down the process tremendously, that they thought, maybe these are adding not enough value to be worth the effort. And so they ran some small scale experiments, and within a very short period of time, they were able to identify a few out of that batch, just a few, that were very cumbersome, that were taking an extraordinary amount of effort and time and resources, and were adding literally zero value. And they validated this to their level of scrutiny. And by eliminating those ineffective criteria, they now are able to meet their goal for 2016. This is what she shared with me.
Yeah.
And I will say that situation affects a tremendous number of lives. I feel tremendously honored to be able to do this kind of work. And I think that the methods and techniques and approaches have potentially enormous global impact. And not just in Silicon Valley software making. It's really about how humans can work together effectively and efficiently, and frankly, with a lot of joy. I want us as humans to be joyfully productive. And that I think that that's where we find flow. I don't know if you're familiar with Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow.
Very much.
But, it's one of the most valuable human experiences to experience flow. And it's that combination of effectiveness and efficiency and connectedness with the people you're collaborating with. So earlier you said something about all these engineering managers coming up in organizations and vying for their position as VP. And, I've never been that person. And I don't actually appreciate those games, those competitive. And I know that I'm one personality type. There are other personality types, but I believe that if we as leaders, and I think we're all empowered to be leaders, if as leaders we make the people around us enormously successful and collaboratively successful, then we will be recognized, and we can ask, as I did at Adaptive Path, we can ask for that recognition. So from my point of view, the best way to get ahead is to create functional team outcomes. And that comes from not being competitive, but instead having that respect and trust, right? When you have that balanced team with respect, trust, feedback, all of those values, then things just move so smoothly. I would say that, and this is not a commercial for Pivotal, but what I experienced as a customer of Pivotal is that they could build high quality, defect-free software every day without drama forever. And I wanted to know how to do that. And so that was 2007. So in the years between 2007 and when I joined Pivotal, that's part of what my exploration was. How do I make that happen on purpose?
So it's great that the White House recognized your work and wanted to work with you. And that's a big endorsement, as well as being a part of Pivotal here. But I'm sure that your work is met with resistance. And I'm sure for our viewers out there who might be interested, but thinking, oh gosh, but my boss, co-founder, teammates are just not going to go with this or not be open to it. How do you deal with that resistance? I know you mentioned the invitation to not buy, but are there other ways in which some of our viewers can kind of slowly, start to incorporate these ideas?
Absolutely. We meet with resistance all the time. There are skeptics, and some people are actually haters And I'm okay with that. That's fine. And we do start with that invitation not to buy. You say, look, we've experienced that this works for people in a wide variety of situations who have to gain alignment or make decisions, that sort of thing. And what you might want to do, because we've experienced that this is successful in a lot of contexts with a lot of different kinds of people, with a lot of different kinds of problem, is just try it.
Yeah. Just
give it a try. And I'll show you some things that you can try. And if something's interesting, I'd be happy to coach you through the next steps. Mm-hmm. So that's the thing. Invitation not to buy. Let's just give it a try, right? So that's the kind of raw introduction. That's how we start. Mm-hmm. But then the next thing is, how do I do it when I go back home? Okay, so the coach is gone. Yeah. What do I do now? And so you say, okay, you need to create an island of freedom. Now, this is an idea that was just published by Eric Ries in a book that was only available to his Kickstarter backers, so I'm not going to plug it. But this islands of freedom concept is really powerful. What it says is that as an entrepreneur in a team, and sometimes that team is in a very large organization, sometimes it's just two people and, in a coffee shop. What you want is to know, what are the boundary conditions within which I can have autonomy? And you can negotiate that. So I'm going to pretend, let's just talk about situations where there's some organizational structure around. There's some number of people. It's a company of 100 or 100,000, right? You say, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to give this a try. I experienced it over here. I want to give it a try. What are the boundary conditions within which you will not meddle, right, boss? So you enlist autonomy. You enlist your supervisor person. Yeah. In creating autonomy within certain safety conditions. So a set budget that's not going to be messed with. Maybe that budget is $1,000. Maybe that budget is $100. Maybe it's $100,000. Mm-hmm. I would say don't start there. So some amount of resource. I have this many hours each week. I have this much money for a month, right? So what are the negotiated ways that we can make that have as little negative impact on ourselves, our customers as possible? You do that negotiation. And then you get the boss to agree to not meddle, to enforce those boundary conditions, to hold accountability for the outcomes of the effort. Mm. But then, so once you have that little island of freedom and you know what those boundary conditions are, and you get that one person to say, yep, I'm not going to meddle. This is an experiment. We're going to see how it goes. Then you can evaluate the outcomes and decide whether or not to move forward. Mm-hmm. So that technique is, it's pretty sophisticated organization management. Yeah. But it's actually, when it comes down to it, pretty simple and human. Again, I want to go back to this respect and trust values. It requires respect and trust. So the person who's creating that safe space, that person who's, in an empowered place to create that safe space, they need to trust enough that they don't micromanage or meddle. Yeah. And the entrepreneurs inside that kind of island of freedom need to trust the boss enough that they're willing to give it a real try and not hide bad news. Yeah. Right. So part of this is that there's going to be some amount of transparency and trust and respect. Mm-hmm. So that's how you give it a try the first time. And that's what our minivan story was about, is that within this island of freedom, they knew what their boundary conditions were. They were able to have give it a small try, a short workshop with a small number of people to evaluate a certain thing. And once they had results from that, they were able to have the conversations they needed, because they could say, I got to tell you, data is very persuasive. So we did this thing. Here's our methodology. Here's what we learned. Let's talk about what we should do next, given that insight.
Yeah, I like what you said about basically showing the outcomes as the impact, and then, maybe it's more money, maybe it's how we can do this at scale, etc. Sure. And I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with, because they're wondering what can they show as impact, or oftentimes they sort of dismiss the showing the impact, right? It's just like really being excited, especially in engineers, and I am one so notorious for this, of just being so excited about doing the work.
Right.
But then realizing, oh, yeah, it has to translate to
it turns out
users, dollars, keeping us in business, putting a roof over our head. So I think that's important.
And part of that trust is that you have to agree to show the bad news as well as the good. Right. That's part of maintaining that trust relationship that gets you the next island of freedom.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been a great conversation.
Thanks.
And for our viewers out there who are curious and want to take some next steps, what would you recommend?
Well, this is going to be surprising because I'm recommending an engineering book, but I'm not recommending it for the engineering. I'm recommending it for the management, right? It is a management book and it's brilliant. The book is Extreme Programming Explained, second edition, not first, second edition. This edition, Kent Beck wrote with his wife, who is an organizational psychologist. So together, they were able to create this really rich picture of why these methods and techniques work. And I say, I made everybody who went through the program at Luxr read it. I ask a lot of people here at Pivotal to read it. I read it myself at least once a year, but specifically chapters 1 through 7. That's the part where it's about the philosophy and the principles, and it explains so frankly the dynamics that are just human, that just are common to every person on the planet, and what we need in order to have effective team dynamics, effective teamwork, so that we can be efficiently and find that flow and have the joy of creating something awesome together and making a huge impact. And so that's, I think, step 1 is read chapters 1 through 7 of XP Explained, Extreme Programming Explained, second edition.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Janice.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it's been great. And I know our viewers out there are going to get a lot out of this episode. And thanks for all of you for tuning in today. And special thanks to our sponsor, Pivotal Tracker, for their help in producing this episode of Femgineer TV. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends, your teammates, and your boss. And subscribe to our YouTube channel to get the next episode next month. I'll catch you next time. This episode of Femgineer TV is brought to you by Pivotal Tracker. Build better software faster.